I wanted to speak on the murder of Botham Jean, but I wanted to talk about it in terms of a Marxist analysis, because I think that's the whole, it's the reason why we're here, and it's what we can bring to the struggle. The two key factors that we have to look at, I think, as Marxists, when we're in a situation where we actually see a police officer get convicted, which is such a rare event, is one, we have to look at it in terms of dialectical materialism and the way conditions are constantly changing. So we look at the struggle as a continuity of struggle. So, for example, the Black Panthers and Black Lives Matter, on the face of it, you can look at that as two separate struggle incidents, but in reality, it's part of a continuity of struggle. The Black Panthers changed the United States, and the successive generations of African Americans grew up in that changed country. So whether you are familiar with the history or not, the current generation of black activists is informed by the actions of previous generations. And when you look at when you tend to look at things in that sense, I think that this case in particular becomes more clear. And the other factor that I wanted to talk about was the nature of oppression, because I think when we look at the state and we think about it being so powerful, we tend to think of oppression as sort of like a forward steady march where the oppressor is just increasing their domination. But I think that it's more accurate to look at it more as a waltz, where you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The oppressor moves forward, they increase their domination, and then they meet resistance, and they have to take a step back. And the reason for that is that the oppressed and the oppressor are not, it's not the powerful and the powerless. It's the more powerful and the less powerful. Some power is not no power. And if you ignore, as the oppressor, if you ignore the resistance of people, the emotional reactions that they have, and you just bowl forward and just go right over them, you're risking open conflict. Even if you win, you end up being totally exhausted. And the reason why I bring this up is because we have to understand the way, not just the way the oppressor works, but the way the oppressor thinks. And this is how the oppressor thinks in aggregate, in the macro level. Getting down to more specific individual agents of the state, I wrote an article about this, and I quoted Malcolm X, who said that the U.S. is a racial powder keg. Every police commissioner, every mayor, every prosecutor, when they know that the next police shooting or the next acquittal of a police officer could essentially turn them into the next Daryl Gates. For people who aren't familiar, Daryl Gates was the chief of the LAPD when Rodney King happened. He was the second longest serving LAPD chief in California's history. And his career was, for him it was amazing. He was one of the most venerated police chiefs in America. And then the Rodney King beating happened, and the LA uprising happened, and his entire career was re-examined through the lens of that incident. And all of the bourgeois media turned their backs on him completely. He was forced to resign, and everything that he had created, that prior to that the bourgeois media had referred to as innovations and cleaning up LA and bringing order, were actually heavy-handed tactics, and he wasn't using the right oversight, and he had lost control of his police force. And the reason is because he had failed to do what the state is supposed to do, which is to protect the property of the ruling class. When you have an uprising like that, you, as a police officer, you failed the capitalist class. And so the prosecutor who brought the case against Amber Geiger, even the judge who gave her a hug, like, these are the types of things that are in the back of their mind. They don't want to be the next Daryl Gates, and they don't want to have the next LA uprising happening under their watch. And so that speaks to the power of resistance movements and the effect that it has on the oppressor psychologically. And we also should look at the character of the state as a militarized force. As leftists, I know we tend to look at the police as all-powerful. I'm just going to come out and say I disagree with that analysis. If you look at the police want to present themselves as a paramilitary force, but I don't think that they actually are. They train in counterinsurgency doctrine. They have military equipment. But if you look at insurgent attacks that they faced and the reaction to it, it runs totally counter to the very doctrine that they hold up. Specifically, I'm talking about something that happened in Dallas when Micah Johnson killed 5 police officers and injured 9. Or in 2014, in reaction to the Eric Garner and Michael Brown killings, 2 police officers were killed in New York City. The reaction of the police wasn't to take all that equipment and training and gear and start doing like door knock raids and coming down the way we see in like the troop surge in Iraq. They didn't use counterinsurgency. Instead, they got off the streets. They said, we're not going to go to a call unless you send 2 officers at a time. And then they went on the media and they literally cried and said and begged for sympathy. And the reason why I bring that up, it's not to necessarily to mock them or to say that they're not tough. It's to say that they are, they're not a combat organization, and that plays into their analysis for what they're going to do. The police might dress like a military, but they're not a military. And that means that their ability to react to us is limited. And that means that when we resist against them, to us, I don't want to say that their hands are tied, but like I said, their options are more limited, I think, than we would like to believe. It's one thing to beat protesters during a protest and to be aggressive against people who have made it clear that they will limit themselves, because, you know, that's what we do when we go out on the street. We make it very clear we're going to limit our tactics. We're using more decency than the police would ever use. It's much different to attack someone who is using insurgent tactics, and the police have made it clear that they want no part of that. So again, I bring this up more so that we can kind of understand the terrain that we're on. With Botham John getting back to this trial, the attorney for the family said that this was a huge victory for African Americans, and that now we will see police officers held accountable, which will then in turn lead to a change in police culture. He's half right. Like, it's a victory for African Americans. It's not going to lead to a sea change, and I don't think it's even going to lead to more convictions specifically. Because again, this is why I say we have to look at this materially, and it's why I brought up the example of Botham, of Daryl Gates. In this instance, in this one city, you have a few agents of the state who made the decision to make a concession because they were afraid of what has been happening in this country. You know, they look at, you know, the way that Black Lives Matter can shut down a highway. I talked about in the article that they shut down a Dallas Cowboys game, and then when the protesters were locked up, people got angry and then there was just more protests. So they tearfully and remorsefully gave up Amber Geiger. That's why the judge hugged Amber Geiger, by the way. They were saying, listen, I'm so terribly sorry, but I've got to give you up to these people because I don't want the city to blow up. And so we shouldn't assume that that's going to continue to happen. That was a choice that one person on the spot made, a careerist choice. And we know that there are contradictions within the state because just a few days later, one of the witnesses was assassinated. And his name was Joshua Brown. And I mean, if people aren't familiar, he showed up dead. He was shot several times. And now there's sort of this very difficult to believe story being presented. What this shows is that there are other people in the Dallas Police Department, or their white supremacist auxiliary is what I would call it, that don't think this was a worthwhile concession to make. And that's basically the whole thing that I'm getting at here, is that we have to understand the mindset of these people. And we also have to look that that's a contradiction within the police department and within law enforcement. You have one prosecutor who pursued this case, and he pushed it pretty hard, and he gave, his closing argument, and he actually got a conviction. And then there are other police officers, presumably that he knows, that he sits down with, that he goes to dinners with, who think he made the wrong call and think that you have to go harder in this situation. And that split is something that we on the left need to be aware of and need to exploit. Because contradictions don't just happen by accident. They happen because of the pressure. Like when you're putting a massive amount of weight on concrete, that fissure that creates, it's created by the weight, it's created by the pressure. So when we look at the fact that one prosecutor decided to actually convict, and the fact that there was an assassination, that division, we actually created that. And we should understand what our power is in the fact that we were able to do that. So the state fears the Black Lives Matter movement, and they fear Black Lives Matter because, of its ability to hurt, to do material damage, to hurt the economy. But one of the primary reasons why Black Lives Matter has been such a dangerous movement is because it raises class consciousness. Every time that activists go out in the street, they hold the moral high ground, they confront the police, and they feel massive resistance. And that's how they understand the differences between the classes and the differences between the people in the state. Not everybody who goes out to a Black Lives Matter protest knows that before they go, but they know that when they leave. And that's tremendously important. Like, I like to think about New York City Shut It Down, A group. They were, for a long time, for years, going every single week. Every single week they were sharpening class consciousness because they were pressing people up against police brutality, so in a way that and it's that oppression, when you're facing it face to face, it changes how you think. And all over the country, that's the way Black Lives Matter has kind of operated. It hasn't been strategic. There hasn't been kind of like a grand plan, but the tactics have always been to directly confront power, partially because of a liberal belief that if you present grievances to power, that they'll correct them. But in that confrontation, you've seen the shift in people's minds, and that is a danger. The other danger of Black Lives Matter is that it's a very intersectional movement. We know that it was started by 3 queer women, and one of the major currents in the Black Lives Matter movement is drawing attention to the oppression of black women, and the idea of bringing people together and connecting struggles, and the fact that there are so many struggles with solidarity struggles that have been done with black and indigenous people, and then black and queer people. This awareness that we're all part of the working class is very dangerous to the powerful. And then the third factor is that Black Lives Matter emerged like 2 years after Occupy Wall Street. The idea of a major economic uprising followed almost immediately by a major black uprising is one of the most terrifying, nightmares that the ruling class can possibly imagine, because it's very easy for those streams to cross, right? That's a threat to the working class, and the bonds of solidarity end up getting built too, because people share tactics. People who are in Occupy share tactics with Black Lives Matter folks, and they start to learn things, and you get cross education, and ultimately it's all building towards uniting the working class, almost by accident. But the ruling class sees that, and they fear it, and socialism generally is on the rise. I've been doing some thinking about how. Oh, that's my time. Anyway, well, just in conclusion, I've been doing some thinking about how. I don't know how that's working. Anyway, the fact that socialism has just exploded in recent years, it's really hard to wrap your mind around how we went from a situation where socialism was an absurd concept and all of a sudden it's like cool. And it's particularly happened with the younger generation. But this is the confluence of a lot of very dangerous things for the working class, for the ruling class. So essentially, in conclusion, the conviction of Amber Geiger is essentially the fruit of the Black Lives Matter struggle. And it's not an impressive fruit. After 5 years of very bitter struggle, it's not a lot. It's 10 years. I mean, that's a lot in certain developed nations, but 10 years for a murder, it's not a lot. But it's important to understand that we still did that, and we did it from a disorganized, spontaneous movement. If we continue to unite the working class, if we actually continue to focus and prioritize, the state has so many obvious apparent weaknesses, we will sharpen their contradictions and we'll create new contradictions. There's just a tremendous opportunity. This is sort of like a building that's ready to collapse. You just hear like a little bit of a rumble, and you maybe like a little bit of dust coming in. You're very far from the building coming down, but that's how you know. These are the signs that you need to see, and this is what we need to know to say, like, oh, we're on the right track. Like, we have to now refocus and unite and strategize and prioritize. So, and think in those long terms. So that's essentially what I've drawn from this. But yeah, thank you. One of the questions raised was the way you can the way that there are attacks on, black witnesses, people who have stand up for police oppression. I didn't mention the people who have mysteriously died in Ferguson. Or I think we're going on 5 or 6 activists who have had mysterious deaths there. And I guess the main thing is that, in the global south, that kind of reaction from the state is very common. And listening to the talk on Ecuador, which was really amazing, the reason why that happens in places like that is because the state is always in crisis mode. And if it starts to happen here, that's kind of how we know that our state is in crisis mode. That's what the ruling class does. They're not, it's like trying to snatch food away from a dog. They'll snap at you very quickly. They don't give you warning, and they don't say you're pushing my boundaries. Can you please stop? They just bite. And I don't know what it is psychologically about human beings, but if you look throughout history, you go back to ancient Rome and you have people trying to make land reform, and the next thing you know, they're murdered and thrown in the Tiber River by the Senate, by the highest, most dignified people in the society. Ruling classes don't like to have their wealth taken from them, and they don't like to have it even threatened, and they don't give warnings. So it's strange to see it happen because our ruling class hasn't been in crisis mode recently, but they are now, and I think that's why we see these kinds of things happening.